Fish keeping is a hobby where it takes time to learn the best ways to do things and the most effective ways to keep fish alive, breed them, and just increase your overall level of success. But today, I'm going to tell you about a few things I've learned in my 16 years keeping fish that could really bypass some of those obstacles for you and lead you to being more successful faster in this hobby. So, the first thing I want to talk about is something related to adding fish to your new aquarium. And I think this is a problem that a lot of people run into with the first tank they ever get. Everyone wants to add fish right away, and I'm no different. Even when I set up a tank now, 16 years into keeping fish, I want to put fish in as fast as I possibly can. And I think that's just human nature. Now, the problem is human nature also leads you to feed fish in coordination with how many fish you see in the tank. Now, a lot of people will say, oh, you shouldn't add very many fish to start off in an aquarium. And to some extent, that's true. But what's more important than how many fish you add to begin with is how much food you feed them to begin with. Because the real problem is if you don't have beneficial bacteria started in the tank and you feed too much, you'll get an ammonia spike and your fish will die. Now, if I had a 10-gallon tank that I was starting for my first tank and I put 12 cardinal tetras in it, if I feed them just a very small amount every day, smaller than I eventually would once the tank is fully, I guess people say cycled, but I would just say established. It's more about the amount of food you put in than how many fish are actually in the tank, because the amount of food determines the amount of waste that is going to be produced, which is the problematic part. So it's kind of hard to learn as a new fish keeper what that means, but fish can go a long time without food or with limited supplies of food. So it's really more important that you're careful how much you feed in the beginning rather than careful how many fish you introduce at once. Now, the second thing I want to talk about is pH. Now, if you're looking up a fish online and trying to figure out if you can keep it and what conditions it needs and how best to provide a good tank for it, there will often be a listing on, oh, it needs a pH from 6 to 6.5, or maybe not that specific, but you'll get a range like, oh, this fish prefers a pH from 7.5 to 8.5. And those numbers can be valuable, but with most fish, they can go outside the range that is listed, and it really just depends what water those fish were raised in. A lot of fish now are raised in captivity and not in the same water they experience in the wild, which means that they're adapted to a different pH range than what they would normally experience in wild conditions. Now, a perfect example of this would be German blue rams, which you see one on my shirt. It's my favorite fish. In the wild, they live in the Amazon, in the Orinoco, which is a river in Colombia and Venezuela. And water conditions are generally a bit acidic, below 7. So you would think, oh, this fish requires an acidic pH. However, most of the rams I've kept have been raised in high pH. A lot of them are raised in Israel and also other captive locations in the United States. And a lot of those locations have high pHs, but through generations of breeding, those fish have become used to a pH that is significantly higher than their wild pH, and they may actually prefer that higher pH to the lower one. So it's really important that when you see a pH guideline, it's really more important what pH the fish is in when you buy it versus what pH it's in the wild, which is generally where those recommended pH ranges come from. Similar things exist with temperature. Fish like the white cloud mountain minnow come from the white cloud mountain minnow comes from the mountains, White Cloud Mountain in China, and there is snow on that mountain, I believe. It's cold. They don't require a heater, but I've also kept them in the upstairs of my house which gets up to 82 degrees in the summer, and they've been fine. So it's really kind of not as precise as you'd think with what pH you need and what temperature you need. You really just have to play it by ear and see what works. Now, the third thing I want to talk about is the importance of having a tank in reserve. Now, if you're starting your first aquarium, you might not need to do this. But having a 10-gallon tank ready to go in case you have babies, in case you need to quarantine fish, in case you need to isolate a fish that's experiencing aggression from another fish, it's just really valuable to have that because you might not need it, but if you do, it's better to have it on hand than have to run to the store or set up some kind of Tupperware container or any type of less effective setup for what you're trying to accomplish. So if you see right here, I have a 10-gallon tank, and in that tank, I have some baby bristlenose plecostomus. Prior to my bristlenose having the babies, I didn't even have that tank set up. And then I was like, well, might as well use it for this. I've mentioned in a past video that it's kind of dangerous to get into a pattern where you just keep getting more tanks. But I feel like having a reserve 10-gallon tank is a good way to avoid like a big upgrade, like, oh, my fish had babies, I'm going to buy another 40-gallon tank so that I can grow them out, versus a 10 is sort of small enough that you feel comfortable setting it up and shutting it down again, depending on your needs. So I think that's a valuable asset to have, especially once you get a little more into the breeding aspect, because you never know when a new fish is going to have babies and when you might want to sort of partition the parents from the babies, or just two separate types of fish that aren't interacting well for whatever reason. Now, the next step that I want to talk about is that hands-on experience is always better than research. Now, that's not to say it's very important that you research what fish you're going to keep before you keep it, but in the end, you really just need to get your hands on the fish and figure out how it works. An example of this for me, which I've discussed before, is German blue rams. They're considered very difficult to keep. They are very sensitive, but I spent 2 years afraid to keep them because of how hard they're said to be, which is true. They are. I've killed quite a few, but I've also bred them. And it's really just important that in order to learn in this hobby, you have to sort of force yourself to level up and see what works for you and see what doesn't, because you may not be a scientist, but you're sort of conducting a scientific process by recognizing what works, what doesn't work, making small changes over time, and just kind of understanding over time that, yes, I know how to do this because I've done the process before. It's like if you've only baked a cake once, you're not really going to know what you're doing the first time and you might mess it up. But once you've tried it 10 times, it becomes more automatic and easier to execute. Same thing goes for setting up fish tanks, breeding fish, and anything like that. The more practice you have with it, the more effective and efficient you're going to be. Now, I kind of mentioned this before, but another lesson I've learned is that fish can go a long time without eating. And this is really important because a lot of people are afraid to get fish because they think it's going to be a lot of work. And I'm not going to say it's easy, although I would say it is definitely easier than most pets. And a lot of people will choose other pets over fish and then say, I don't want a fish tank because I don't want to have to clean algae. My tank gets dirty all the time. And a lot of these issues are just not true. If you feed your fish properly and do a little bit of routine maintenance, keeping a fish tank is significantly less work than a dog, a cat, even a hamster, something like that. And you can go on vacation for a long period of time and not really have to worry. I live in Florida right now, and I had to evacuate for 2 hurricanes in the fall. And I just, I knew, well, I didn't know how long I was going to be evacuated, but I felt more confident leaving my fish with no food than setting up auto feeders, because fish can go a long time without food. And I ended up being evacuated for a month and a half, and I came back and I had only lost one fish, and it was my smallest angelfish, which seemed like it was struggling anyway. And it just shows that fish are a great pet to have if you need to go on vacation a lot, because they're going to pull through so long as you're not gone for, I don't know, if I was gone maybe 3 months, maybe I would have experienced significant losses. But a month and a half is a long time to be able to be away from your pet and not have them suffer any significant consequences. So that's my plug for keeping fish. I just think you can go on vacation, you can do whatever you want, and for the most part, they'll be totally fine. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about is evaluating your local fish stores. Now, right now I live in Florida. I've also lived in Chicago for most of my life, and I lived in Seattle for about 6 months. And what I've experienced is that different locations throughout the country, and I'm sure throughout the world, have significantly different levels of quality in terms of fish stores. So the biggest thing I look for when I go into a fish store to evaluate if I think it's good, and this is specifically related to freshwater fish stores. In Florida, we have a lot of more saltwater focused fish stores, which I'm not really interested in at this point. But for freshwater fish stores, I look for sort of the base fish species that I feel like every freshwater fish store should have. So that includes like cardinal tetras, neon tetras, rummy nose tetras, Cory catfish, bristlenose plecostomus, angelfish. There's sort of just, once you keep fish long enough and have been to enough fish stores, you start to understand what the staples are that it's kind of expected you should have. And that's one good way to evaluate if a store knows what it's doing. There are a lot of other things that go into it. You have to look at the health of the fish. This kind of comes with experience, but if you look at fish and they looked active, they respond to you coming up to the tank. If you happen to see the employees in the store feeding the fish and they're coming up aggressively to eat, that's a really important thing to look at. I've really found that certain parts of the country just don't have great fish stores. I don't know if it's that there isn't demand for freshwater tropical fish, or if it's just sort of a dead zone where no one's gotten motivated to make a really nice store. But if you want to see really high quality fish stores, go to Seattle. In Seattle, there are probably 6 to 10 decent fish stores within like a 1 hour radius of each other. And in Florida, I have one decent fish store that is within that same 1 hour radius. And it's probably only as good as 2 or 3 out of those 6 really good fish stores in Seattle. So in that case, if you evaluate your local fish stores and they're not super high quality, there are a lot of good online options for acquiring fish. I've used a local fish farm to me called Imperial Tropicals. They have a website and they have a vast array of different fish species. I've been into their, I don't know if you want to call it a warehouse, the big building with a ton of tanks. They had so many tanks that I couldn't even get through all of them. And there are other places like the Wet Spot Tropical Fish, which is located in Portland, Oregon. They have a really great in-person store as well, but they have a very complete, I don't know what word to use, catalog of a ton of different species of fish. There's probably not a species of fish you could think of they don't have on their website. at least not one kept in aquariums. So don't get discouraged if your local stores aren't great. It's going to be a little more challenging going online to try to find the fish you want, but I'm confident that you can find them, and you shouldn't allow that to stop you from having a great aquarium. Now, if you want to see some more tips, check out this video that I made last year. I made sure to make new tips in this video so that I'm not repeating myself. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.